200 years ago this very day, our forefathers were engaged in a struggle with the British that would reshape the lives of all men. They were fighting to make a dream come true, a dream that was to see their children and their children's children bow to no man and to honor but one flag. Their determination and valor can be summed up in the words of Nathan Hale. Calmly facing his British executioners, he proudly said, "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." What a mixture they were, French, Dutch, English, Scotch, Welsh, German, Swedes, and others. All here to share the same dream of freedom, all thrown together to fight the wilderness and the Indians as one, until they were melted down to form a new breed of proud men and strong women. Then on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted what was to become the most historic document pertaining to human liberty ever penned by the hand of man, the Declaration of Independence. Finally, on September 3rd, 1783, after 8 long years of bitter fighting, the peace treaty was signed, and they were citizens of the United States of America. Now the new dream of expanding our boundaries from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Canada to Mexico was acted out in reality. From the original 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard in 1776 to the ownership of what is now the entire continental United States by the year 1848. Step by step we grew. First the purchase of a new territory, then the migration to settle and tame those wild lands, and at last statehood. But all was not well in this young nation of plenty. Economic and social differences between the highly industrialized North and the agricultural-based South changed from toleration to bitter hatred. And so, in 1861, America once again went to war, but this time with herself, pitting brother against brother and father against son. What you're about to hear is true. It is the story of brave men dying for what they believed. It was the turning point of the Civil War. The scene was the cemetery of a small farming community in southeastern Pennsylvania. Wearied by the lengthy oratory just completed, the large crowd restlessly awaited the next speaker coming to the podium. Slowly, distinctly, in a voice trembling with emotion, the tall, heavily bearded man spoke to the multitude before him. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. On that day, November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States of America, spoke the words that would become synonymous with the hell that erupted for 3 days at Gettysburg. On July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, in the year 1863, 160,000 American fighting men ripped away the blanket of obscurity from that little country town and turned it into a household word, standing for death and destruction. Fully 1/3 of all who fought there never left, or left not the same as before. For 3 long days, General Robert E. Lee's 75,000 fearless warriors threw themselves again and again into a battered but unyielding foe, as if they knew or cared not of the permanency of death. Stumbling forward, then backwards, blinded by their sweat and maybe their own or their neighbor's blood, tripping over a friend, or what was left of a friend, they fought on and on, as if to make Valhalla eager to open its doors. Boys died whose short days before had blushed at stories of wild women told by the campfires, for they were far too young to have held any women but their mothers. When it was over, and all who were there could see what they had done, a stillness fell over the battlefield, broken only by the sound of tears rolling from eye to cheek to ground. On the 25th, 50th, and 75th anniversaries of the battle, reunions were held and attended by those from both the North and South. During the 75th reunion in 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated the world-famous Eternal Peace Light Memorial. Several weeks later, a sheet of paper was found in the bushes nearby. On it was written a poem. It read, "We stood there side by side at last and talked about a war long past, when he wore gray and I the Union blue. The air was still much like before, except back then the cannons roared, and men lay down to move their weary limbs no more. The crowd around us shied away. They heard us speak 3 long days of life and death, and how proud men learned quick to pray. when he wore gray and I the Union blue. We sat a while upon that wall of stone that felt so many fall, when brave men charged across that golden field. With eyes cast down upon that hallowed, lonely ground, he cried and spoke with little sound. There's nothing good to say of death, except perhaps I may forget the hell it was out there. Soon to my tears fell free, as he went on to tell how life had ceased to be that faithful day, when he wore gray and I the Union blue. He spoke of seeing friends go down to coat the bloody waiting ground, then have no fear of hell's sweet sound of cannon evermore. As time went by, he sighed and said, "It's done. Let's talk no more of sword or gun. But praise the Lord, for here is one." To this day, the author remains unknown, but it is a certainty that one sunny day in July 1938, two ancient warriors spoke of how it was and the strange way it came to be. In the early part of June 1863, Lee moved his 3 infantry corps north through the Shenandoah Valley and into Pennsylvania. His plan, capture Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. His purpose was twofold. First, to draw Union General Grant away from his siege on Vicksburg. And second, to further demoralize the northern populace in the hope that they would demand that Lincoln sue for peace. The Union Army, now under the command of General George Meade, faced the difficult task of locating and engaging Lee's troops in such a manner as to be positioned between Lee and Washington, D.C. Under this restraining factor, Meade cautiously moved his giant army of 85,000 men further north in Maryland. Scouting into Pennsylvania for the fast-moving Union left flank was General John Buford's 1st Cavalry Division. Buford arrived in Gettysburg on June 30th and was told by the frightened townspeople that a large Confederate force had just exited to the northwest. Buford decided to wait for their return. Thus, on the night of June 30th, 1863, the stage was set. The players were in the wings, and the next sun would illuminate history in the making. On July 1st at 5 a.m., the combat-hardened Confederate Division of Major General Henry Heath of A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps had the distinction of being the first Southern troops on their way to immortality at Gettysburg. Immortality was the last thing in Heath's mind that morning, however, as he was going to Gettysburg only to chase out the militia General Pettigrew had seen yesterday, and more important, to get his men some much-needed shoes. Both Heath and Hill were convinced the mounted troops seen by Pettigrew as he was leaving town yesterday had to be militia. Neither could believe the Army of the Potomac was at hand. During the early morning hours, Buford was informed of the coming Confederate tide, and after sending a messenger to General Reynolds urging him on without delay, sent skirmishers forward about 4 miles northwest of Gettysburg on the Chambersburg Pike. Slowly, Heath's men rolled up to and over the skirmishers. At 8 a.m., the first solid line of defense was set up on a rise about 1 mile northwest of town called Her Ridge. General Buford realized his job now was only to delay Heath's division until Union infantry reinforcements arrived in the person of General Reynolds. With the situation worsening, he pulled back to McPherson's Ridge. Reynolds arrived on the scene about 10 a.m. and immediately recognized the importance of holding this defensive position until more troops were available. With Reynolds came the 1st Division of his 1st Corps, which contained the famous Iron Brigade. For 2 hours, the battle raged on as if never to stop until Heath's division withdrew to regroup, and the battlefield felt a momentary calm. During those bitter hours, many brave men from both the North and South gave their lives for the cause in which they believed. Perhaps the one most felt at the time was that of Union General Reynolds. Riding close to the front, urging his finely tuned unit into action, he was cut down by a Confederate sharpshooter with a bullet in his brain. From about 11 a.m. until noon, command of the Union forces was held by Major General Abner Doubleday. Although taking severe punishment, the 1st Corps of General Meade's army fought brilliantly that morning, and military historians have credited them with winning the 1st round. Unfortunately for them, the 2nd round would have quite a different ending. Arriving with his 11th Corps about noon, Union General Oliver Howard was informed of Reynolds' death, and a senior officer took command of the field from Doubleday, sending 2 of his divisions to the right flank of the battered 1st Corps and keeping 1 in reserve on Cemetery Hill. He felt able to hold until help arrived from the 3rd and 12th Corps. At this point, Howard had the 1st Corps to the west of Gettysburg on and around McPherson's Ridge. Here, his 2 divisions of the 11th Corps were to join the 1st and extend its line northward to Oak Hill. Howard had barely given the orders when he was made aware of Lieutenant General Ewell's Confederate Corps moving on Gettysburg from the north and northeast. Immediately, the 2 11th Corps divisions were ordered back to form a line facing north, with their left flank meeting the westward facing the 1st Corps. Union troops never occupied Oak Hill. This is the high ground north of town, and it was well used by Confederate artillery. 2 English breech-loading Whitworth cannons were positioned here during the 2nd and 3rd days' fighting. Because of their extreme range and accuracy, many Union troops felt their deadly sting. Today, the Peaceflight Memorial stands in Oak Hill, precisely where death rained down from Confederate cannons in July of 1863. During the noonday lull, Confederate General A.P. Hill was planning to avenge his earlier defeat. General Heath was ordered to attack with his 2 fresh brigades and told he would receive support from another of Hill's divisions. Meanwhile, General Ewell had 2 divisions nearing the Union lines, General Rhodes from the north and General Early from the northeast. Round 2 was about to begin. Rhodes struck first at 2 p.m., smashing into the Union 11th Corps. An hour later, Heath renewed his assault on the 1st Corps to the west. Fierce, bitter fighting raged across both fronts until General Early's perfectly executed flanking attack on the 11th Corps right began to push Howard's forces back toward Gettysburg. Courageous acts were commonplace at Gettysburg. Bravery beyond the call of duty abounded. One such heroic act occurred during Early's assault on the Union 11th Corps. First Lieutenant Bayard Wilkeson was in command of Battery G, 4th U.S. Artillery. Battery G was situated north of town near Rock Creek on a low knoll. Outgunned more than 2 to 1, Wilkeson's position was a death trap. Volleys of Confederate shells clouded the skies over the battery. But astride his horse, the lieutenant rode from gun to gun, giving advice and shouting words of encouragement to his men. Urged on to greater heights by the show of courage, Wilkeson's men fought on. Finally, the inevitable happened, and the young New Yorker, who already received 2 brevets for gallantry in action, fell mortally wounded. His father, Samuel Wilkeson, a war correspondent with the New York Times, arrived in Gettysburg late that night, only to be told of his son's death. Heartbroken, the elder Wilkeson sent a dispatch to the Times, which was published on July 6, 1863. The ending paragraph served as a fitting memorial to his and other departed sons. My pen is heavy. Oh, you dead who at Gettysburg have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied. I rise from a grave whose wet clay I have passionately kissed, and I look up to see Christ spanning this battlefield with his feet and reaching fraternal and lovingly up to heaven. His right hand opens the gate of paradise. With his left, he beckons to these mutilated, bloody, swollen forms to ascend. Union Brigadier General Francis Barlow's 1st Division of the 11th Corps was hit first by Early's flanking attack and retreated south towards town. Barlow, seriously wounded during the fighting, soon found himself surrounded by Confederate troops. Brigadier General J.B. Gordon of Early's division came upon Barlow and asked the wounded Union general if he could be of any service. Certain he was going to die, Barlow asked if he could get a message to his wife, a Union nurse somewhere on the battlefield. Being the gentleman he was and thinking the young officer close to death, Gordon complied. And that evening, under a flag of truce, Barlow and his wife were united. As Sir Winston Churchill later said, the American Civil War was the last war between gentlemen. Ewell's Confederate Corps continued to push the entire 11th Corps back towards Gettysburg. At about the same time on the Western Front, A.P. Hill threw Hender's fresh division against the sagging Union 1st Corps. A major collapse of the entire Union line was inevitable, and at 4 p.m., General Howard on Cemetery Hill saw his troops retreating through Gettysburg. Mass disorganization would perhaps be the best way of describing the Union Army's retreat. No one in command was familiar with the streets of town. Individual soldiers and regiments found themselves trapped by the onrushing Confederates. 3 hours earlier, at General Meade's headquarters in Tonytown, Maryland, Major General Winfield Hancock had been ordered to Gettysburg to assume command of all Union troops. Arriving on the scene in time to see the retreat through Gettysburg, Hancock noted with approval Howard's defensive position on Cemetery Hill. In order to more fully understand the fighting which took place over July 2nd and 3rd, it is necessary to examine the defensive structure which Hancock formed with the Union Army. Imagine a giant fishhook measuring about 4 miles from end to end. Beginning with a barbed point is Spangler Spring. This is about 1 mile southeast from the edge of town. Moving northwest towards Gettysburg is a heavily wooded rise called Culp's Hill. Going around and starting on the hook curve is Cemetery Hill, which is located adjoining the edge of town. Connected to Cemetery Hill is a long ridge running south and named by the townspeople Cemetery Ridge. At the southern edge of Cemetery Ridge is another rise, similar to but higher than Culp's Hill, called Little Round Top. Several hundred yards further south is a still higher hill called Big Round Top. The Army of Northern Virginia simply formed a larger fishhook with troops on the southern edge of town running east to west, and then circling south on a rise called Seminary Ridge, which runs parallel to Cemetery Ridge and is about 1 mile distant. With a reserve division of Howard's 11th Corps well emplaced on Cemetery Hill, Hancock quickly placed the 2 retreating divisions in the same area and sent the battered remains of the 1st Corps to his right flank on Culp's Hill. The Union's left flank on Cemetery Ridge had already been secured by Buford's cavalry. Union troops continued to arrive and were spread out in Hancock's fishhook position. Satisfied all was secure, Hancock relinquished command to 12th Corps Commander Major General Henry Slocum, then rode south to report his findings to Union Commander Meade. Men on both sides lay down with tears in their eyes and thought of comrades for whom the fighting was over forever. Sleep came to but a few, and to those it was shallow and fitful at best. Most of the surviving warriors simply prayed that their tomorrow would be different from their today. Accompanied by his chief of artillery, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, Union Commander Meade arrived at Cemetery Hill several hours before dawn on July 2nd. Hunt's foresight was responsible for the Union artillery having more than ample supplies of ammunition, which proved to be such a critical factor on the 3rd day's fighting. At the same time, on Confederate-held Seminary Ridge, Lee was having his problems. After having seen Hill's and Ewell's corps push the stubborn Union troops back through Gettysburg the previous afternoon, Lee was exuberant. Any secret doubts he may have harbored about the invincibility of his troops were blown away like the dying leaves of an October day. What a rude awakening he received later that evening when he first conferred with Lieutenant General James Longstreet and then with Lieutenant General Ewell. Longstreet, Lee's senior lieutenant and commander of the yet-to-arrive Confederate 1st Corps, argued violently against assaulting the Union position. Ewell, commanding the 2nd Corps, which was spread through Gettysburg, faced the Union troops on Cemetery Hill, declared his troops were not capable of making a successful offensive maneuver. Lee was confused and dismayed. His men had won a major victory that day. Why were his generals so opposed to pushing ahead? Determined that an assault would be made, Lee ordered Ewell to withdraw his corps and reinforce the Confederate right along Seminary Ridge. During the night of July 1st, a strange but touching reunion was taking place in the town of Gettysburg. Wesley Culp, Confederate soldier, native born of Gettysburg, had at last come home. An adventurous young man, Culp had gone south some years before the start of the Civil War. With the outbreak of hostilities, he swore allegiance to his new friends and marched north with Lee. The meeting was a joyous but tearful one, as both family and son seemed to know what tomorrow would bring. Daring not to think or speak of today, they relived a small boy's childhood. Then, torn between a natural love and a devotion to cause, he said goodbye and walked away. Later during the battle, fighting with a dedication matched only by his Southern-born companions, Wesley Culp made the supreme sacrifice and died on the farm near Gettysburg, less than a mile from where he was born. Around midnight, Lee received word that General Johnson of Ewell's corps had found Culp's Hill unoccupied. Ewell requested permission for Johnson to attack. Lee was pleased with the information, although he felt sure that Union troops would have been sent to defend Culp's Hill by now. He was heartened by the knowledge that at least one of his corps commanders at last wanted to resume the offensive. Lee ordered Ewell to have Johnson attack when he heard Longstreet's artillery at the southern end of Seminary Ridge. Now Lee's problem was Longstreet. Meeting again in the early hours of July 2nd, and with a senior lieutenant, Lee explained in detail his plan of attack for the day. Johnson would begin his attack on the Union right at Culp's Hill the moment he heard Longstreet's opening artillery barrage. Longstreet's corps, then to be positioned on the southern end of Seminary Ridge, was to advance towards Little Round Top, then swing north and hit the Union left flank, which seemed to end midway down Cemetery Ridge. After the flanking movement began, Hill's corps would engage the Union troops on Cemetery Ridge with a frontal attack. Again, Longstreet balked. Finally, Lee put his plans in the form of a direct order, and Longstreet withdrew to comply. Poor visibility caused by heavy morning mist and the slope of Cemetery Ridge itself made Lee unaware of another Union corps posted beyond what he thought was the end of the Union line. The corps hidden that morning from General Lee was the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General Daniel Sickles. During the hour before dawn, when Meade had made an inspection tour, the 3rd Corps was in the general area he wanted it to be. General Sickles either never received direct orders from Meade as to the exact positioning of his troops, or he misunderstood the orders when they were given. As a result, shortly after 12 noon, the Union 3rd Corps advanced about 1/2 mile, putting its leading brigade in a peach orchard on the Emmetsburg Road, only several hundred yards from Seminary Bridge. Starting at Gettysburg and heading south, the terrain between Union-held Cemetery Ridge on the east and Confederate Seminary Ridge to the west changes abruptly after the first mile. The first mile could best be described as a giant amphitheater with both ridges gently sloping down towards the center. Only an occasional gentle rise breaks the flat continuity of this peaceful valley. The Emmetsburg Road, which runs north and south, cuts through here in a diagonal path starting at the southern edge of Seminary Ridge and ending at the northern edge of Cemetery Ridge. The next mile down to the Round Tops contains heavily wooded areas, a small stream, stone fences, a peach orchard, huge rounded boulders scattered here and there, a wheat field and a high rise between the two ridges, which reaches its highest point in the peach orchard on the Emmetsburg Road. The most prominent feature is Devil's Den, a collection of these monstrous boulders piled one on top of another to a height of some 50 feet above the valley floor below, and about 500 yards in front of Little Round Top. It was not until 4 p.m. that Meade learned the 3rd Corps advanced to this area. Sickles offered to withdraw to the originally planned defensive position on Cemetery Ridge, but Meade, hearing the boom of Confederate cannon, sighed, "I wish to God you could, but the enemy won't let you." 54 Confederate cannons, some firing at ranges of less than 700 yards, blazed a path of broken trees, shattered rock, and smoke-filled air for 8 of Longstreet's brigades to follow. Follow them they did into the peach orchard, the wheat field, and on to Devil's Den. On they came, some in strict military formation, others crouching for a moment behind a stone fence or a splintered stump that was once a tree. On they came, only to be held in check by a stunned but courageous foe. Now reinforcements from the Union 2nd Corps rush forward to stop the tide of gray and push them back a step or two. But still on, driven by whatever force it is that drives men to greatness they come. The blue line is failing now as they turn and run, walk, or crawl back towards Cemetery Ridge. In desperation, a Union artillery battery is physically lifted to the summit of Devil's Den for its moment of glory. Then it too is gone as the tide rushes on. The Irish Brigade from New York listened to their chaplain before going to battle. Father William Corby raised his right hand and asked God to give each man the courage to fight squarely and fair, and gave them general absolution, finishing his prayer with a warning that any who were traitors to his colors would be denied a Christian burial. The little father sent his flock into battle. Now the retreat of the 3rd Corps is in earnest, and A.P. Hill's Confederate Corps begins their frontal attack on the northern part of Cemetery Ridge. Now Little Round Top, the key to the Union Army's left flank, is about to be submerged by the gray wave rolling forward. General Governor Warren, standing on the peak, sees disaster coming and notifies Meade. Ordering the 5th Corps to the defense of Little Round Top, Meade can only wait and pray. "Artillery is needed up there, boys," someone shouts, and up the rocky, heavily wooded, roadless slopes go the Union cannons, horses straining against their hardest with men, both cannoneer and infantryman, pushing from behind, raising them to the top. The tide is closer now at the bottom of the slope. Union infantry charges down, and Union cannons blast away. Confederate sharpshooters in Devil's Den are cutting down one brave cannoneer after another. On and on, back and forth, up the hill and down the hill, until at long last, Little Round Top is secure. As if on cue, with the withdrawal of Longstreet's men from their assault at Little Round Top, A.B. Hill's corps pulls back to Seminary Ridge after 2 hours of bitter hand-to-hand fighting. It was sundown, a time for the Confederate Second Corps to have its turn. This time, the Union right flank at Culp's Hill is the target, but this time there will be no pushing back the blue wall. Union cannons roar down the steep slopes, lighting the skies for dying Southern boys to see their dead. Soon they stop this daring, deathly charge and are content with a foothold at the bottom of the hill. Once more the gray reaches out, this time for Cemetery Hill. Once more they come and come and come. And finally, through a hole, they charge over the crest only to be beaten back with gun butt, sword, and saber. At last the calm. At last comes thoughts of food and drink and maybe sleep. And some who drank took their fill of Spangler's Spring near the foot of Culp's Hill. Its cool, clear water was shared by many that night. Some wearing blue, some gray. They came in peace, some laughed and played. But most stood round and softly spoke of what they saw and did that day. July 2nd, 1863. Light from a full moon shed ghastly illumination on the open cultivated fields leading up to Culp's Hill. First Lieutenant Frank Haskell of the Union Second Corps wrote of the devastation. They are desolate, trampled by the countless feet of the combatants, plowed and scored by the shot and shell. The orchard splintered, the fences prostrate, the harvest trodden in the mud. And more dreadful than the sight of all this thickly strewn over all their length and breadth are the habiliments of the soldiers, the knapsacks cast aside in the stress of the fight, or after the fatal lead had struck, haversacks yawning with the rations the owner will never call for, canteens of cedar of the rebel men of Jackson, and of cloth-covered tin of the men of the Union, blankets and trousers and coats and caps, and some are blue and some are gray, muskets and ramrods and bayonets and swords and scabbards and belts, some bent and cut by the shot and shell, broken wheels, exploded caissons, and limber boxes and dismantled guns. And all these are sprinkled with blood, horses, some dead, a mangled heap of carnage, some alive, with a leg shot clear off, or other frightful wounds, appealing to you with almost more than brute gaze as you pass. And last but not least, numerous, many thousands of men. And there was no rebellion here now. The men of South Carolina were quiet by the sides of those of Massachusetts, some composed with uptorn faces, sleeping the last sleep, some mutilated and frightful, some wretched, fallen, bathed in blood, survivors still and unwilling witnesses of the rage of Gettysburg. Throughout the night of July 2nd, a staff meeting went on in Union headquarters. Meade asked each of his commanders 3 questions. Should the Army stay in its present position or withdraw? If the Army stays, should it remain on the defensive or attack? If the Army stays, how long should it stay? The results were near unanimous. The Army would stay in its present position and continue in its defensive action for not more than 2 days. That night, Lee rode out to inform his corps commanders of the plan of attack for July 3rd. Johnson's division, now entrenched at the foot of Culp's Hill, was to renew their attack, while at the same time Longstreet was to move against the center of Cemetery Ridge. Johnson began his assault as ordered, while for reasons unknown, Longstreet started moving his troops south for an attack on the Union far left flank around Big Round Top. Shortly after Longstreet had issued his marching orders, Lee rode up to his headquarters. Angry and frustrated with his senior lieutenant, Lee patiently explained exactly what he wanted. Told he would have but 15,000 men with which to storm the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet again argued with his commander. Twice that number is hardly enough to cross those open fields, he pleaded, but Lee remained firm. My order to you, General Longstreet, is to attack as directed when ready. That was the order which resulted in over 10,000 casualties in a battle lasting less than 2 hours. Meanwhile, the fighting continued on Culp's Hill. Nowhere on the Union line was there a better defensive position than here. Natural fortifications were improved with solid wooden breastworks, and trenches circled the hill. But men were told to take that hill, and try indeed they did. Crouching low behind the trees, they hug the ground as the trees are ripped and torn and splintered. They crawl ahead until even the very earth itself seems to vomit balls of lead. Knowing nothing now but determination, they rise to their feet as if to need to know once more that they are men, and charge that solid wall of flame and fire and death. Finally, at 12 noon, after giving more than their all, the Confederates withdrew and the fight for Culp's Hill was over. For 1 hour, the Fishhook knew peace. Then at 1 p.m., 2 Confederate cannons fired from the Peach Orchard signaled more than 100 other cannons stretching up and down Seminary Ridge to begin the greatest artillery barrage ever seen or heard on the American continent. Union troops on Cemetery Ridge hugged the ground and hid behind whatever shelter they could find. Moments later, the outnumbered Union cannons belched their reply. Then the only sound was a deafening, unbroken roar, heard for miles, that continued for 2 hours. Suddenly it was over. Glancing at his watch, a Union artillery captain noted the time, 3 p.m. It is the eye of the storm. Every Union eye on Cemetery Ridge now strains to see through the smoke-filled valley. Every man from General Meade down to the lowest private is staring into the woods of Seminary Ridge, waiting to see what they knew they will see. There they are, someone shouts, and anyone looking away the moment before, then looking back on the call, it appears as though the green leaves have turned to gray. Stretching north and south for nearly a mile, Confederate troops step out from behind the trees and form in perfect battle formation. Longstreet reluctantly gives Major General George Pickett the order to advance. Lee and Longstreet feel that either their candidate has destroyed the Union artillery or that the enemy is now out of ammunition. This is a critical factor, as their own artillery has exhausted its long-range shot and shell. This is exactly what Meade wants them to believe, for as Pickett starts the Confederate advance, Union artillery is ready to turn Lee's dream into a nightmare. To the sound of martial music, the gray line moves forward, red battle flags fluttering and snapping in the breeze with bayonets flashing in the sun. Now the Union cannon speak again. Great holes are being torn in the Confederate ranks. These are quickly filled, and on they come. Union infantry, waiting for the command to let loose with their musket fire, look on with a mixture of awe and admiration at those out there, for they too are men of flesh and blood. Finally, the command is given, fire, and 1,000 Union rifles sing their song of death. Give him the canister, yells one of the cannoneers as he sees the battle flag surging over the Emmitsburg road. Double canister next, over 150 balls of lead, spreading its pattern of death into that surging, unbroken wave of humanity. But still it comes. The forward guns are overrun now. The Union line is bending near that clump of trees. The battle flags are over the wall. It's now or never for both sides. At last another wave. This one blue and larger, far larger than the gray, rolls up from behind and pushes back the charge. Back they go, back across the road, turning to fire, turning again to run, then to walk. And bowing their heads, they cry in anguish. Pickett's charge is over. Of the 15,000 men Lee committed to this most famous of battles, less than 8,000 staggered back across those blood-soaked fields to the safety of Seminary Ridge. Walking out to meet them on their return, Lee is reported to have said, "I'm sorry, General Pickett. This has all been my fault." Except for a colorful but meaningless cavalry encounter, that same afternoon, east of Gettysburg, Lee's great northern offensive had run its course. For him, the night of July 3rd had to be one of soul-searching. Perhaps listening to the cries and screams of the dying, he began at last to see what so many great generals before had seen, that invincibility is but an impossible dream. Then on that November day, while listening to Lincoln's impassioned plea, the people of Gettysburg realized things would never again be quite the same. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln was right, for although the war dragged on for 2 more heartbreaking years, it finally ended at Appomattox in 1865, and the United States of America was reborn to become the greatest nation ever to exist on the face of Mother Earth, reborn to give far more than she ever hoped to receive, reborn to accept the poor and unwanted from other lands, reborn never to die.